This is Retrospective Facilitation, a podcast for facilitators that want to make their retrospectives even more effective. Well, this is the second of a series of special episodes where I interview former military war veterans now working in tech-related industries. And we reflect on their wartime after-action review experiences and similarities with agile retrospectives. In this episode, I interview Jon Schneider, a fellow pivot working on the Java Spring team. He tells us a little bit about action items generated during after-action reviews, or AAR, in a war zone. And he tells us how tactical cycles constantly changes and how the team collaborated and used the ingenuity to adapt and circumvent situations that were only apparently outside of their control. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
Yeah. Cool. And you're based in Central, is it in Colorado? Where are you?
I'm in Central Missouri, actually, which is just rural middle of nowhere. That's why I work for the spring team, so I can live out here.
Cool. Nice. And Jon, you were in the Army, is that correct?
That's right. I spent about 12 years in the Army altogether, close to 9 as an officer, the last 9 years or so.
Cool. What was your role? What were you doing in the?
Sure. Yeah, I was commissioned originally as a transportation officer in the Army Reserve. My wife and I made the decision to stick to the Army Reserve so we could stick close to Missouri originally, not get moved around quite as much. I didn't yet then know how my association with reserve transportation would actually lead to me being deployed more frequently than probably the active component is in some cases. So shortly out of school, I was assigned to a heavy equipment transport unit. There's only 6 of them in the Army at the time, so 3 of them in the Army Reserve, 2 in the National Guard. I think 1 in Nevada and 1 in North Carolina, and 1 on active component. They needed 3 of those companies overseas at any given time. So you imagine there's 6 of these companies in the Army, they need 3 of them at any given time. It was basically every other year flip overseas, just because of the kind of unit that it was. This unit, it was a big unit. So heavy equipment transporters, they haul tanks and artillery pieces, large pieces of construction equipment, anything really big. These are very big vehicles, 40 tires on the trailer, hydraulically actuatable trailer, just a huge tractor, bigger than anything you'll see on the road here in the U.S. And there was a small outfit from each company, a platoon-size element, so about 60 people, that ran what we call gun trucks, which were convoy escorts for those heavy equipment transporters. And that was my role. I was the platoon leader for the gun truck, or the combat side of that mission. So we originally started in M1151 A1 Humvees, just Humvees, up armored Humvees, and it had 50 calibers or Mark 19 grenade launchers on top of them, and we escorted these convoys all over Iraq, from the port in Kuwait to wherever the load was going, anywhere in Iraq. So
cool. And so how does the debriefing work in the Army? How did it work for those the experience you had?
Sure. Yeah. The Army has a process they call an after action review, or AAR. In my platoon, like I mentioned, there were 60 people, roughly. We had 3 squads of gun truck packages. So these 3 squads could be accompanying 3 different convoys in 3 completely different places in Iraq at any given point. Each of those squads was ran by a staff sergeant, and that staff sergeant would perform regular briefings before a convoy and after action reviews after one to collect feedback. And the structure of them, I don't know how similar they are to a typical tech retro, but it was really kind of a 3 negative, 3 positive sort of framework that they did, and tried to focus on very specific technical detail.
Cool. What kind of environment was it? Like, did people feel feel free to speak up? Was it like a blame kind of like situation? I feel sometimes in retrospectives, people fear about blame, about being blamed about something. But I feel that when you're deployed, when it's like a war zone, is blame set aside? Is it still like that fear of being blamed about something, or is it more about how can we improve? How can we make this better?
I think the negatives were typically focused on what that individual squad could improve and these are 10 to 15 people that that work together as a team constantly. So the Army has a reputation for being a very top-down organization. I think it's used as almost an extreme example of a top-down organization. My experience is quite the opposite, actually, in that it's far more decentralized than any organization I've really been in outside of it. These squads were very independent. If I was a platoon leader of 3 squads, they could be hundreds of miles apart. There's no way I could really control their day-to-day operations. So yeah, these team members relied on one another. So this AAR was for them. It wasn't for for somebody else to review their performance. It was for them to get better and to survive together.
Cool. Do you have any story or any detail that you can share with the audience of one of those?
I think I give you 2 examples of where negative, or I guess things that we can improve on, comments coming out of AARs changed our tactics in a significant way. So the first one comes from the tactical environment in Iraq changed quite a bit over the years. The convoys on the road were one of the most dangerous places to be. It's kind of in some ways the soft underbelly of our environment over there. So convoys were attacked more frequently than, say, posts were, at least in an effective way. So we knew that we were at substantial risk. Early on in the war, convoys were targeted with pressure plate or improvised explosive devices. We call those IEDs. It was as simple as somebody getting out there and digging a hole in the road and placing usually like a 155 artillery round with some pressure plate trigger in the road, and then just burying it again. And so a truck that ran over it, it's just basically like a mine. Think of an artillery round as a mine. That's kind of how it would work. But as time went on, we got more and more effective at identifying people placing things in the road, and usually air support from above would eliminate that threat. So tactics would shift, and they moved to remotely detonated devices, in different ways. They would move to devices triggered by a command wire or via a radio of some sort, a garage door opener, an RC car adapter, whatever it would be. One particularly deadly form of IED, it actually had its own name, called an explosively formed projectile. These were devices that had a shape charge that would take a molten copper plate and turn it into a copper plate and turn it into a molten sphere of copper, if you can imagine this, flying through the air, and it could just punch right through the armor of our vehicles. So that was really deadly to us. Explosively formed projectiles it took a lot of sophistication to build something like that. So they were typically really well hidden, in a way that just made it hard to see on the side of the road. So they oftentimes hid them in rock, encased in concrete, in a way that made them appear like they were a rock, just like a rock along the side of the road, and they'd be placed kind of alongside other rocks. So we kind of knew that this was the problem, but they're hard to spot, right? It just looks like a regular rock. So somebody figured out that if you looked at a pile of rocks like this through a pair of thermal binoculars, that the explosively formed projectile would look a little hotter than the average rock because it had all that copper inside of it. So you could basically identify a fake rock, via thermal binoculars. The trouble was, of course, that if thermal binoculars can't see through glass, and you want your gunner to be below the level of the turrets, so they don't get shot by a sniper. So this is kind of this chicken and egg problem. Do I get blown up by an EFP or do I get shot by a sniper? What do we do about this? And we didn't really have a resolution to it for a while, and our teams were talking, and what we found is that, at that time, PlayStation portables were a really common thing for troops to have on the ground. Just like it was just a fad at the time. A couple of our squads came up with a device that they could mount the thermal binoculars to the outside of the truck and use regular VGA cables to tie it to their PlayStation portable, and then use an extra turret joystick that we found to move the binoculars left and right. And that's what we used to identify explosively formed projectiles. So using the PlayStation portable.
Nice.
Which was guaranteed to be one in every truck,
Nice.
I think it's an example of where like a review comment like made some actionable change to our tactic on the ground without having to go through the whole defense acquisition process and some contractor building an actual device for this. We're just able to fabricate something.
So the teams on the floor had a sense of agency. They could like change and try things, and they just reflected on some of that input. And was that across, you said, multiple teams that like a different team found out about the thermals and this team came up with the PlayStation? And how did they communicate between each other?
Absolutely. I mean, I would say there was, a little bit of contribution from all the teams to kind of build the final device, but, we kind of prototyped it and ran it for a little bit and made some modifications and then distributed it to the rest of the trucks later.
Fantastic story.
That was really interesting. I think case there, review comments coming out saying, we need to do something about this particular tactic that changed.
And did that information go up the ladder? Like
It got up to, it didn't go as high as you'd think. I mean, it probably got up to our battalion organization, so it may have influenced a couple gun truck companies, but didn't go much further beyond that, I don't think. And then, of course, tactics shifted again. These tactical cycles were relatively short, actually a year or two at a time. So
when you say tactical cycle, you mean then like stuff on the floor changes again?
Yeah,
would you?
That's right. Yeah, the finding certain devices to be ineffective, the enemy tactic would change in some way, in a substantial way.
So the plan doesn't survive contact.
That's right. Yeah, ultimately, there was an earlier incarnation of this similar approach where their explosives were being detonated via infrared sensor that was looking for engine heat signatures, and it was targeted to hit the passenger side of the vehicle when it saw a heat signature. And so again, a similar really scrappy team came up with we're just going to put a pole on the front of the truck, and we'll run 3 or 4 engine glow plugs in a box at the end of the pole, and we'll just put it like 10 feet out in front of our truck, and so they would detonate the explosive early. We called that a rhino, and so then then there's a shift to tactic. Well, we got to target it back 10 feet further, and so there's this constant back and forth of tactical change and response.
I see an analogy with like the way Agile works and how you iterate over a solution, and stuff changes. Obviously, very different stakes, but it's interesting how we need to adapt in our day-to-day job here at Pivotal as IT specialist and now on the floor. Really powerful, interesting story. Jon, you said you had another.
There's one other thing I think came out of the AARs quite a bit, and I think did influence acquisition a little higher up. I mentioned before I was a transportation officer, and I belonged to a transportation company that donated a platoon to perform gun truck missions. And there were other infantry companies originally that performed the exact same mission. In fact, my platoon was responsible. We had 3 squads of gun trucks, and we were responsible for escorting up to 9 squads of heavy equipment transporters. Well, the math doesn't work out there, right? If more than 3 of those heavy equipment transporters are on the road at any given time, I can't do all of them. I can only do 3 of them. So we were pretty much 100% task out the whole time. So any of the slack that my platoon couldn't pick up was just picked up by one of these infantry companies performing the same mission. So exactly the same trucks, exactly the same roads, the vehicles being escorted, everything's the same. But at the time, the Army had two computer systems to track the location of forces on the ground. One was called the Blue Force Tracker, and it was used by combat units like infantry units. And you could see on a computer screen in your truck the location of enemy forces that were known, which is basically none in this case, and friendly forces, friendly combat forces, helicopters, tanks, snipers, infantry units, things like that on the ground. The logistics units, so transportation fell under, Army logistics. They were sourced with a computer system called a movement tracking system, which only showed on the map logistics assets. Now, I was mentioning tactics before. As we're moving a convoy down the road, you'd pass underneath bridge overpasses. And for a time, it was popular for insurgents to attempt to drop, especially Russian RKG grenades on top of our heads from bridge overpasses. So if we're going to go under a bridge, the lead gun truck would usually flare out and spotlight the bridge. You would just put a bright spotlight on top of the whole bridge and just look for people up there. And each gun truck would do that as it went by. So it's looking for people up there that are a threat. Well, if you imagine a bridge is kind of a higher, location in an otherwise flat terrain. And so it was a favored place for snipers as well to sit. If there was going to just be a sniper sitting somewhere waiting for enemy activity, a bridge was a good place to be. Well, we don't want to spotlight a sniper because it basically reveals their location. They have to move. They're not happy about that. And of course, we can assume if there's a sniper on a bridge that there's not going to be somebody else up there that means us harm. So we prefer to just not spotlight them.
So you meant like a friendly sniper, is that right?
That's correct. Yes.
One of your right.
Yes. Friendly sniper. Yes. Clear difference there. So the movement tracking system didn't show us the locations of snipers. That was not helpful to us. The Blue Force Tracker did. So yeah, our squads would say, we want Blue Force Trackers. We want Blue Force Trackers. But we couldn't get them. The Army acquisition process failed us there. It says, you're a logistics unit versus a combat unit. You get this and that instead of that. So we coordinated amongst ourselves. We of course went over to the Blue Force Tracker contractors repair shop at various places throughout Iraq and tried to acquire ourselves new systems. And they would have just plenty of equipment, just replacement parts, whole systems available, but they couldn't give one to us because we didn't have the right unit designation. They did say we can always swap one for one, a bad part for a good part. And so we had our solution then. Most nights when I would put a convoy down, or we would just go and search in dumpsters for broken parts and place a bad part on an otherwise good system and take the truck in and have it replaced and set that part aside. And if you do that enough times, you can build up kind of essentially from nothing a full complement of Blue Force Tracker system. So we did that a couple times, actually. We did that, and then the command team changed, and they reported the fact that we had these, as a property asset in the company, and they'd be taken away from us, and we'd have to do it again. And we did this a few cycles before, I think, ultimately higher headquarters understood the need for them.
Cool. And so the trigger there was coming out of one of the debriefings, and then the ideas. When were they brainstormed?
Right. It's not obvious why we would need them. You'd think, well, you're just moving along the road from point to point. What's the purpose of you having this kind of thing? So it's the intricate detail of, I need to be able to spotlight for grenades being dropped on my head, but there's potentially a friendly sniper. It's a nuanced, a tactical situation that's not apparent to, the 50,000 foot view, but the situation.
Awesome.
Yeah.
This is a great story, great insights.
It's also, I think, a big reason why I think as leaders, like, as a lieutenant, it was important for me to rotate amongst the squads and be present with them on the ground, not taking over the mission. Not, I would say this E6 staff sergeant is still responsible for this convoy when I'm participating in it, but just to be present with them, and so that you really understand what they're going through and what their needs are on a more detailed level. And that's a principle, again, I haven't found as common outside of the Army, the idea that you lead from the front as an organizational leader. So
awesome. This is really powerful, really interesting conversation, Jon. Is there anything else you want to share?
I don't think so, unless you have any questions on those things. That's those are the two examples I really had in mind, anyway. So.
No, I think this is really good. Now that you asked me, maybe like one question I have is my friend in the Marine said they were doing school circles to do these debriefings in the Marines. How was the logistic for the Army? Were you doing it in a room? So were you doing it right after you would come back? A little bit of maybe color around like sitting around a table, like on the ground, that kind of like.
No, it'd always be standing out in the open somewhere, usually just beside the trucks in a yard somewhere after we've fully taken everything down.
So after you would come back from one of the field missions?
Right, immediately after that, yeah, before anybody's released to do their other things, because then people tend to scatter a bit, so start forgetting details.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And would you ever skip one of those debriefings, or was it kind of like a
all through training, it's just through training, it's just emphasized that this is just something that you do. It feels a little ridiculous, honestly, in training. Sometimes you just think, you're going through this exercise. It can feel a little ridiculous in practice too, I think, sometimes. But it's a habit, and you make it a habit, and you continue to do that. And a couple of good things can come out of habits like that, like these things I said here. It's you never know what's going to come out of them. So
cool. Awesome. Jon, this is really interesting, really fun. Thank you for taking the time to do this.
Thank you.
I appreciate what you do, what anyone in the military does. So thank you
I'm happy to share. I know there's not a lot of information about what the daily life was on the ground there, especially in these last two conflicts. So it's good for folks to understand, I think.
Yeah, totally. So can a civilian give you the military salute, or is that ridiculous?
I'm curious what you would try. The salute looks. That's what I thought you might do. Yeah, the salute looks very.
I'm from Italy, so I think it's the regular one.
Really powerful examples and stories by Jon. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm planning to do a few more interviews. There is like a F-18 pilot that will talk with us about similar topics. If you know of people that work outside of the tech industry, in the military, or for example firefighting, that can tell us a little bit about debriefings in their fields, that'll be probably interesting for us facilitators to use as examples and to reflect on where some of the habits we have in our retrospective come from. And it's really interesting to reflect about those higher stake environments. Well, thank you so much for listening. This is Enrico Teotti. Until next time.